The story of sex power and survival in history is rarely told from the perspective of those who lived at the bottom of society. But today we pulling back the curtain on one of the darkest and most hidden corners of the ancient world. Welcome back to the channel where we explore the secret sexual practices and shocking realities of human history. If you've ever wondered what it meant to be a woman enslaved in ancient Greece, prepare yourself, because this story is not only uncomfortable, it's horrifying. Behind the marble temples and great philosophical debates, behind the myths of democracy and freedom, existed a brutal reality. Tens of thousands of women lived and died as slaves, their bodies reduced to tools of labor, pleasure, and punishment. This is their story. In ancient Greece, slavery was not a side note. It was the foundation of society. Athens, the city that celebrated democracy, rested upon the backs of those who had no rights at all. A female slave, whether captured in war, bought in a market, or born into bondage, entered a world where her humanity was stripped the moment her status was known. Their breasts, hips, teeth, and even genitals could be inspected by potential buyers, not out of medical curiosity, but as proof of fertility, endurance, and sexual value. Some were purchased for agricultural work or domestic service. In fact, one of the most thriving businesses in classical Athens was prostitution, and nearly every prostitute in the city was a slave. Unlike the courtesans known as hetairai, who cultivated wit and charm, and sometimes even influence, the vast majority of enslaved women in brothels were forced into lives of relentless exploitation. The philosopher Solon himself, celebrated for his reforms in Athenian politics, is said to have established state brothels stocked with slave women to provide cheap sex for men of all classes. In those dim, cramped rooms, a woman might be forced to service dozens of men a day, with no say in the matter, her earnings flowing entirely to her master. And while men of Athens could stroll in and out of these brothels as casually as they might visit the marketplace, the women inside had no exit, no hope of freedom, and no protection from violence. They were property, their suffering legally invisible. But sexual slavery did not stop at brothels. Inside the household, female slaves were often compelled to serve as concubines for their male masters. Greek society accepted that men had sexual access not only to their wives but also to slaves, and the law did not define such acts as rape. A slave had no ability to refuse. In fact, the very concept of consent, as we understand it, simply did not exist for them. For the wife of the household, this often created bitter rivalries, as enslaved women might be forced into intimate proximity with their masters, sometimes even bearing children. Those children, too, were enslaved at birth, ensuring that the cycle of degradation continued. The conditions were brutal. A female slave could be beaten for disobedience, branded with hot irons as punishment or identification, and sold again and again. Sexual abuse was not an accident of the system. It was baked into the very structure of slavery. Ancient comedies and plays often joked about the use of slave women's bodies, normalizing their exploitation as entertainment. And while philosophers like Aristotle debated lofty ideas about virtue and reason, he himself wrote that some people were natural slaves, destined by their very nature to serve others. Women in bondage were trapped in a world where even intellectual giants considered their suffering part of the natural order. Yet, beneath the veneer of Greek civilization, the horrors multiplied when we look more closely at the daily realities. In the next part of this story, we'll go deeper into the domestic sphere where enslaved women were not just sexual servants, but also the silent backbone of households raising children that were not their own, carrying burdens, both physical and emotional, and enduring punishments that blurred the line between discipline and sadism. If the slave brothels of Athens represented one extreme of sexual exploitation, the private household represented another, equally suffocating world. Here, enslaved women were bound by endless labor, perpetual vulnerability, and the constant possibility of abuse. Inside a Greek oikos, the household, slaves cooked meals, spun cloth, carried water, and tended children. For female slaves, this often meant raising the children of their masters with tenderness, while being forced to abandon their own offspring who were property, not family. The cruel irony was that an enslaved nursemaid might be cherished for her care, even as her own body was subjected to cruelty behind closed doors. Sexual coercion in the household was normalized to such an extent that masters' wives often directed their jealousy not at their husbands, but at the enslaved women themselves, blaming them for seduction rather than recognizing their lack of agency. Enslaved concubines could be forced into near-marriage-like arrangements, yet with none of the protections of law or status. If a mistress of the household decided a slave was no longer desirable or posed too much of a threat, she could demand the woman's sale, separating her from any children she might have borne. In this way, enslaved women lived in a perpetual state of fear. Fear of violence, fear of being sold, fear of having their children taken from them. Punishment for resistance was merciless. Ancient records and artwork show whips, shackles, and collars used on slaves, and women were not spared. Branding on the face or body was sometimes used to mark ownership or as punishment for escape attempts. One of the most chilling aspects of Greek slavery was its casualness. There was no sense of secrecy about these horrors. They were widely acknowledged, yet rarely condemned. For free citizens, this was simply the way of the world. Even beyond physical abuse, enslaved women endured psychological torment. Their bodies were always available, their dignity constantly undermined. Imagine the daily humiliation of being forced to undress in front of others, of being groped, examined, and used without choice. In the domestic space, they were both hypervisible, as sexualized objects, and invisible, as human beings. Their silence was demanded, their resistance crushed. And yet, despite their oppression, some enslaved women managed to carve out small spaces of influence. A trusted household slave might wield authority over younger servants or gain some degree of favor by managing the home. But these were fragile positions, always subject to reversal, always overshadowed by the brutal reality that she remained property. Children born to enslaved women added another layer of cruelty. These children, no matter who their fathers were considered slaves too. Even if the father was the master himself, the child inherited the status of the mother. In some cases, masters might free children they favored, but this was rare. More often, those children grew up in bondage, perpetuating the cycle. In many households, enslaved women watched their children sold off like livestock, powerless to intervene. The grief must have been unimaginable, yet it was normalized to the point of silence. Greek literature provides unsettling glimpses of these dynamics. In comedies, slave women are often portrayed as flirtatious or promiscuous, reinforcing the idea that they were naturally suited for sexual availability. In tragedies, they are sometimes pitied but rarely liberated. The reality lay somewhere between these depictions. Enslaved women endured both violence and forced intimacy, trapped in a society that laughed at their suffering. And still, the horrors didn't end at the threshold of the home. To understand the full picture, we need to step outside the private household and into the public spaces of ancient Greece, where slavery intersected with ritual, commerce, and entertainment in ways that pushed female suffering into plain sight. In Athens and other city-states, prostitution was not only tolerated but often encouraged, with revenues from brothels flowing into public coffers. Some enslaved women were also forced into roles connected with religion, where their bodies were tied to ritual. At certain sanctuaries, women could be compelled into ritual prostitution, with their services framed as offerings to the gods. This blurred the line between sacred and profane, cloaking exploitation in the language of piety. The hypocrisy is staggering. A society that celebrated the beauty of its temples also sanctioned the abuse of women at their altars. Entertainment, too, exploited enslaved women. Some were forced to perform in degrading spectacles, dancing or entertaining guests at symposiums, male drinking parties where debauchery was the norm. While philosophers debated the meaning of justice over cups of wine, enslaved women were living examples of a justice system that excluded them entirely. The legal system offered no protection. In fact, the law reinforced their vulnerability. Rape of a free woman was considered a serious offense because it violated the honor of her male guardian, but assaulting a slave woman was not even classified as rape. It was simply considered the master's prerogative. The double standard was stark. Enslaved women's suffering was invisible in the eyes of the law, their humanity erased by legal definition. Yet despite the normalization of their abuse, the existence of these women leaves echoes in the historical record that cannot be ignored. Inscriptions, plays, and philosophical texts provide fragments of their stories, though often filtered through the eyes of free men. The silence of the enslaved themselves is deafening, but that very silence tells us something important. They were never given a voice. Their pain was woven into the fabric of Greek society, hidden behind ideals of democracy and culture that the modern world still reveres. It's chilling to realize that the same Athens that produced Plato and Aristotle, the same Sparta that trained warriors, the same Greece that built the Parthenon and celebrated the Olympic Games did so, while enslaved women were enduring systematic sexual exploitation. The brilliance of Greek civilization, in other words, was built upon their suffering. And perhaps the greatest horror of all is how little that fact is remembered today. As we reflect on these hidden truths, it becomes clear that history is never as clean or noble as it seems. The horrors faced by enslaved women in ancient Greece remind us that beneath the surface of culture and progress lies the reality of human exploitation. Their voices may not have survived, but their suffering shaped the world we inherit. And so, as we close this chapter, I want to ask you, which of these facts shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more of history's hidden stories of sex, power, and survival, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to reveal. And together we can shine a light on the secrets the past tried to bury.